Hey everyone, it's Sean from Sean Woodwork, and in today's video I'm going to be making a simple box for a friend who is turning 40 years old. Now, to be honest, I was a little bit hesitant to publish this video. Although a box is very basic, I think it is a really rudimentary skill that every furniture maker should know how to do. In this video, I'll be cutting all of the parts, slots, dados, and miters on the table saw, as well as how to make and cut the splines for the miter joints. And near the end, I'll cover how to install a hinge. I'm starting off with one continuous piece of oak, and as you can see, it's pretty warped. So this is how I deal with warped wood like this, because if I run this through my jointer, it will pretty much remove all the wood. I'll end up with about 3 millimeters left after I'm done. I just cut all the pieces into smaller chunks, and I keep them in order. That way, as I build the box, I have sort of a continuous grain that wraps around the whole box. And to keep them all in the correct order, I mark the ends where I made those cuts, and then that typically doesn't go away until I start cutting the miters, and then I'll have to switch to tape to keep all those parts ordered. Once I get one face and one edge jointed on the jointer, I can move over to the thickness planer. Now these parts are really small, and the problem with that is if I run them through straight, I'm most likely going to get a little bit of snipe. So as you can see here, I sort of just run them through at an angle, and this way I really don't see any snipe at all, and I can manage some quite small parts. Then I take them to the table saw and cut everything to final width. Instead of sanding the edges, I just gang up all the parts, put a clamp on them, put them in my vise, and then I use my number 4 hand plane, and that gets a really nice smooth surface. That way I don't need to sand it. If I sand this, I'm most likely going to round over those edges, which I don't want. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and sand everything up to 180, both of the faces. The edges I already did with the plane, so I don't need to worry about that. This one board has a big knot that I need to take care of with a little black tinted epoxy that'll dry in about an hour, and then I can go ahead and sand it off. I resawed another piece of oak so that I have a nice book match for the top and the bottom. And to glue these pieces together, I am not going to be using a domino. I'm just going to glue them together the old-fashioned way with some glue and some clamps. I just put some clamps on those 2 joints, and that should keep everything nice and parallel. While I wait for that to dry, I need to go ahead and cut the slots for the top and the bottom of the box. The slots for the top and the bottom are essentially the same. Both are about 4 millimeters in from the edge and 6 by 6. This third cut is the width of your blade. In my case, that's 3.2 millimeters wide and 6 millimeters deep. The placement of the cup is super important. I've got it at 19 millimeters from the edge. Later, when we cut the box apart on the table saw, this will become important. It takes me a couple passes to get to that 6 millimeter width, and I can basically just flip the board around and do this on both sides. And here's what it looks like with all 3 of those cuts. Now I'm going to switch to my cross-cut blade so that I can get a really nice clean miter. I go ahead and I mark which direction all my miters will go, because at this point it would not be good to cut them on the wrong side. I cut these all on my crosscut sled, and I sort of sneak up to a perfectly sharp edge. Here I'm not quite there, so I'll move it over just a little bit until I get to that clean sharp edge that I want. I've got a stop block set up to ensure that both of the long sides end up being the same length, and the short sides I do the same. Now that I've got both of the short and long sides done, I can do a quick test fit to see how that miter looks. For the top and the bottom, I've got my sacrificial fence set up so that I can cut a rabbet around all of those edges to fit in that 6mm slot that we cut before. And I don't really care if it was 5.5 or 6.3mm. I just sort of keep sneaking up on this until I get a nice good fit for the top and the bottom. And I do a quick dry fit before I start to glue everything up. I'm going to apply a couple of coats of shellac now on the inside parts because that'll be pretty difficult to get to later. I stay away from any of the joints where I'm going to be applying glue. I use my jointer to do this. I just lay out all of the pieces against the fence of the jointer. It's nice and sturdy, and then I apply the tape to all of the parts. Next, I flip it over and take it to the bench and apply some glue. And then I can fold up the box and apply some tape around that last fourth corner and let it dry for a couple of hours. I need to cut some splines for this miter box, and I'm going to be using some walnut. I have a few pieces, but they're pretty loose and I think they need to be pretty snug. So I'm going to adjust my thin strip cutting jig, which if you haven't seen that video, I'll leave a link down in the description to check that out. I just take a piece of tape off of the edge, and that's enough to make that spline a little bit more snug in the kerf. Now I need to cut the slots for the splines in the miter box, so I'll use my spline cutting jig to do that on the table saw. I normally just leave the tape on when I do those cuts, and now I'm just applying some glue, and then I put the walnut spline, which I've cut down a little bit to size to make it a little bit easier to deal with. Once the splines are done drying, I can use a flush cut saw to trim those down. And then I sand it back up to 180. At this point, I go ahead and break all of the corners. I just do this by hand with some sandpaper. Remember how I said earlier that third cut, the kerf width at 6mm deep, was going to become important because now we need to cut the box apart, and we'll do that on the table saw. And that cut needs to be the 19mm plus the kerf of your blade. Mine in this case is 3.2mm, so 22.2mm. So I set my table saw fence to 22.2mm. And I set it just slightly under the depth that I need to reach that other cut on the other side. I don't want this thing to go all the way through. I think if you allow that to go through, that could be a dangerous cut. As this box comes apart, it could pinch the blade. So I don't go all the way through here. I finish it on the bench. I just use a blade to cut that apart. In this case, I'm using a carpet knife. I just found that the leverage that gives is quite nice to cut the box apart. And there we go, it comes apart. Now I've got quite a bit of cleanup to do on those edges. You'll need to sand, and to get it to finally fit down over that, it's going to usually takes me quite a bit of passes with the sandpaper, both on the edges and the sides of that lip that's now formed. To add the hinges, I set up sort of a shooting board with a file and this helps to get the edges, both edges of the hinge at 90 degrees to the back, and that will help when you're laying them out later. I first use a marking knife to mark the starting point of each hinge from the side. Now I put my marking knife in that mark that I just made. I put the hinge up against it, and then I can go over to the other side and mark the width. I carry the mark over the corner of the outside of the box. Then I put the top on, and I put my marking knife into that mark that I just made on the corner, and I roll it up into the top of the box, and now I've transferred the width of my hinge to the box top. And now I just have to mark the depth of the hinge. And now I use a very sharp chisel to start cutting down to that depth that I just set. The hinge is too wide to sit in that rabbet, so I'm going to have to cut into the lip just a little bit to allow the hinge to fully sit. Once I get the hinge to fit onto the box bottom, I can move on to the top. I just extend the marks from the corner marks that I made earlier. Now on the bottom I removed material to fit the hinge. On the top I'm going to have to add a little bit of material so that the hinge has somewhere to sit. I like to inset my hinges so that the entire hinge is sitting within the rim of the box. And that means that when I open the lid will sort of stand on its own. But to allow for that, you've got to create sort of this relief chamfer, and that I just do with a hand plane. And now I can go ahead and assemble the hinge to the bottom, and I'll flip it over and assemble it to the top. And here the lid goes all the way back and sort of rests on its own because that hinge is inset. I added a finger slot to the front so it's easier to open the box, and this box is done.